So one of the documentary videos that you've got, episode 8 of The Great War in the Shaping of the 20th Century, the episode's called War Without End. And I actually find that episode one of the most poignant. If you're going to have to watch one of them, I actually recommend that one, since it talks about the aftermath and how the war never ended for a lot of the people who participated in it. And certainly the nature of the mechanized war affected people in profound ways. And one of those ways were the people that were horribly disfigured. Every country had a union of the facially wounded and people whose bodies were disfigured in horrible ways. There were significant improvements made in medical sciences for things like prosthetics. And one of the more interesting outcomes of the war were the facial prosthetics. There were some soldiers who had survived the war but were so horribly wounded that the whole pieces of their face was just torn off, and they looked just horribly disfigured, not recognizable. And an effort that was put together by the Red Cross and a group of doctors and artists got together to try to help those people. And one of them was an American artist named Anna Coleman Ladd, and she was from Boston, very famous for sculptures. And she was asked by the Red Cross to go to Paris. And in Paris, she put together a studio with some other artists where they made these masks for the facially wounded soldiers. And so what they would do is get pictures of them. They would make a cast of their face, what was left of their face, their head, and then they would use old pictures of them and try to reconstruct the mask. It would be made out of this thin galvanized copper, and since the pictures are all black and white, we actually don't get to see how well they worked. But according to the letters that the veterans wrote back, thanking them for this work, they worked pretty well. And so they would try to reconstruct the faces as well as they could. It was this thin pressed metal that they would use that would shape itself, kind of make a shape similar to what your face had been. And they would use glasses to hold it on. And so you'd wear spectacles that would clip behind your ear, and in order to hold the mask on. And they'd painstakingly reconstruct as best they could what these men's faces had looked like, to include using real hair for like the mustaches or beards that they would create. The letters that the soldiers would write back would say amazingly touching things, like my one soldier said, my wife can look at me again without disgust. And this kind of saved a number of the soldiers that got these facial prosthetics, probably saved them from suicide. So Anna Coleman Ladd, she was awarded the French Legion of Honor for her work that she did in Paris. She had a studio in Paris going on for more than a year, from 1918 to about the beginning of 1920. And she produced about 200, or her studio produced about 200 of the masks, and there were some other studios. We don't know how many similarly injured people were involved with the others. We mostly know the American, British, and French ones that went to this particular studio. But it's kind of a haunting imagery that really brings out how terrible the war could be, that it could take so much from a person, their whole identity, and how much work went into trying to restore that. Another one of the more tragic stories, and I would have trouble when I when I go into this was Katie Kolwitz, who they talk about her story in the film. She was an artist from Germany, and quite well known by the First World War. She was a famous artist, known around the world, and she was one of the most accomplished female artists in Germany. She was one of the first women to be given an artistic professorship at a German university, and she was a socialist, and some of her earliest art was advocating for women's rights, such as the right to vote, what they called at that time the woman issue. She was known for some of her very first paintings were woman issue paintings, but she became known for painting and sculpting and drawing subjects that were very emotional. And so if you look at a lot of her paintings, they focus on the hands, convey a lot of the emotion in her art. She was quite well known for a series that she had done in the 1890s and early 1900s called the Weaver Revolt series, where it was this depiction of uprising of peasants called the Weavers' Revolt. She was most famous for that, and a series of other showings that she had done. So quite famous by the First World War. She and her husband were pretty well off. Her husband Carl was a doctor who was also active in the social democratic circles, and was a doctor he was like a charity doctor for the poor. So they believe strongly in what they did. So anyway, even though they were kind of these left-wing people who probably kind of leaned the Jean Jaurès way, anti-war, and certainly some of her art before the war from the early 1900s kind of depicts how tragic it is when people die from some kind of external injustice, and some of her art does reflect that. So she was a very empathic person, like an artist, kind of absorbs feelings and then expresses them. Like most Germans, when the war started, she got caught up in the war fever, and she even wrote in her diary that the war would be a splendid bath of steel, or it was something along those lines, a splendid shower of steel that would rejuvenate Germany, which reflects how so many people, even intelligent ones, were just taken by the war fever in summer 1914. And she had two sons. Their names were Hans and Peter. And Hans was a little bit older. He had already been to college and signed up for the war to be in the medical corps. So he was a doctor in the war, and he survived it. And he didn't die till 1971. Her second son, Peter, he was the younger one, and he wasn't old enough to join the military without having his parents sign off. The father was the one who had to sign off. I think you had to be 20, it was either 19 or 20, to enlist without your parents' permission in the beginning of the war. And Peter was 18 in summer of 1914. And Peter, like a lot of the youth of Germany at the time, he had actually been on vacation in Norway when he heard about with the youth movement. There was this big movement among the middle-class Germans. They were called the Wandering Birds, and it was basically this Boy Scout, what was called the Bundesjugend. It was like the Boy Scouts, and but it was this movement that embraced nature and going on long hikes and stuff. And so he was on one of these expeditions in Norway, and heard about the start of the war, came back and very much wanted to join. His brother had joined up as a medic, so he wanted to join and do his part. He wanted to join and be an infantry officer, and since they came from the middle class, educated, he would be trained to be a lieutenant. The father, Karl, he very much did not want to let Peter do this. And they had a huge argument that Katie wrote about in her diary where the father just yelled, "The fatherland hasn't called you yet." And Peter replied, "But the fatherland might not have called my year, but they need me," reflecting how patriotic everyone was. And Karl was not going to let him join until he got old enough and could make the decision himself, which would have been another year. And Katie was the one who convinced her husband to sign off on it, and she successfully convinced him. Peter went to training, and by October 1914, he was sent to the front, and he participated in the Battle of First Ypres and was killed on the second day of the battle, along with about 250,000 other combatants. Apparently what happened was that his unit, he was lieutenant, so he was in charge of like a platoon or a squad, and they had been split up between the trench and this ditch on the other side of a road, and he tried to stand up. He was in the trench, and he tried to stand up to give some orders to the portion of his platoon that was stuck in the ditch to try to tell them how to get back to safety, to the safer trench. And in the process of standing up and trying to give that order, he was shot, and that was that. Katie was obviously devastated. She actually kept up with a number of the friends he had joined up with, and some of his friends in the war. And what was even more tragic was, I think she kept up with about 5 of his friends, wrote back and forth to them a lot of letters, and 4 of them died. So they did not survive the war, and obviously along with her son, which had been the first one of them to go. She drastically changed her position on the war, and her art had always been a little bit melancholy. It became much darker and kind of more radical, more socialist after the war. And she wanted to make a memorial for Peter. Couldn't really do it. As an empathic person, it was hard for her to express how much grief they had. And she finally was able to sculpt this statue, and she sculpts an image that is vaguely self-portrait of 2 parents, but they look kind of like what Karl and Katie looked like. And it's an image of 2 parents mourning the death of their child in the war. And it's one of the more powerful war memorials, I think. It's not a very big thing. If you ever go to Belgium, I recommend you go see it. I think it's kind of amazing how it the things are actually quite small in the context of the 250,000 people that died in that battle. And the sculpted parents, they grieve for not only their son, but for everyone's son. She became more anti-war after that. It took her like 12 years to make that, to finally be able to do that output. In the meantime, she had been more and more anti-war. Interestingly enough, because of her anti-war activity, that made her unpopular when the Nazis took over in Germany. At least unpopular with the Nazis, not unpopular with the art world. The Nazis threatened her and her husband with jail, with the concentration camps. At first, the concentration camps were used mostly for political prisoners and people who were opposed to the Nazis for whatever reason. But it was kind of an interesting phenomenon that they could not. The Nazis had trouble with famous people like this, because if they'd have put Katie Kollwitz, who was an internationally renowned artist, even more famous by the 1930s worldwide, if you'd have put her in a concentration camp and had she died in that camp, it would have been an international scandal. And Hitler was actually quite sensitive in the 1930s to international opinion. So he didn't want bad news or bad PR to get out. And so they threatened her with putting her in a concentration camp because of her anti-war stances, but she didn't actually go. They couldn't have gotten away with the scandal. What was even more tragic was that she had to live through the Second World War, and her home was bombed, and she died just before the war ended. And I think her story kind of is another illustration of just how consuming the wars were. It kind of took her whole life. She's most famous now. She made a series of propaganda posters in the 1920s along with Otto Dix, and in which they were very much anti-war. And she produced these for a youth convention that ran in the 1920s that was focused on anti-war issues. In any case, this was a representation of how the war traveled with people, and what it took from them and what it continued to take from them. And then in her case, the Second World War took her house and her life. But she remains one of the more famous artists. If there are arts all over the place, some of her pieces are in the Brooklyn Museum in New York City, and she was one of the more renowned socialist anti-war artists.